Okay, so just to explain kind of where the next couple of pieces of this are going to go, Mike just told you a lot of great information about the event itself and how to engage with government purchasing folks. What I'm going to do is try to get your mind right. And by that I mean I'm going to try to focus you on some very basic concepts about how the government looks at contractors and what they need to know, what you need to know about interfacing with them in terms of what they're looking for. I'm going to be followed by Pat Daughter from PTAC, and she's going to help you take what I tell you and put it in a leave-behind format. You know, something that you can share with folks when you meet with them at all these great opportunities that Mike just described. Okay? So this is your time for R&R. That's not rest and recreation. That's responsiveness and responsibility, which are two key concepts in government contracting. And I want to impress upon you that it's different than what you see in the civilian world and doing civilian business. This is just an outline real quick. I'm not going to, well, I was going to call on my friend Scott Schuler. Let me just go ahead and do it. Can you see that picture from where you're sitting, Scott?
Yes.
Okay, can you tell me what that is a picture of? It's Bewitched, okay? And the guy on the left is Larry Tate, who was Darren Stevens' boss. Darren Stevens was married to the witch, right? And the deal with Bewitched was it was an advertising firm. And Larry Tate was one of the named partners of McMahon and Tate. And about half the episodes of Bewitched involved some scenario where McMahon and Tate was out trying to win business, okay? And so the way they won business was they would meet crusty old guys like this who had some company that needed to advertise soup or napkins or whatever it was. And they would meet with the guy, take him out to dinner, take him out golfing, try to impress him, build a relationship, and then win that business, all right? And about half of those episodes dealt with, you know, Samantha twiggling her nose or something and using some kind of magic to win the business for Darren, but Darren didn't know about it, blah, blah, blah. But it was a great show. All right, and I asked Scott because he's a lot younger than a lot of us in the room, but folks my age certainly remember this show because it was on for a number of years. So thank you. That was pretty good.
Very kind of you too, Kid.
Yeah. All right. So that's competition in the civilian world. A lot of times it's relationships and kind of who you know as compared to other factors. And the fundamental thing with government contracting, okay, there's something called the Competition and Contracting Act, and the basic rule is this. Unless there's an exception that applies, all federal government contracts are awarded using something called full and open competition. That's the basic rule. And everything else is either an exception to it or a variation of it, but it's all related to that, and it all gets back to that. So everything that we're going to talk about today kind of flows from that. So full and open competition is the key phrase. So what is that? Full and open competition means this. All responsible sources, and that's the key term for our conversation today, are permitted to submit sealed bids or proposals on competitive procurements, okay? So if you're a responsible source, you're allowed to submit a bid on a government contract, and they must allow you to submit a bid, okay? It's not taking somebody to a country club or out to dinner, anybody. And that's the beauty of the system and being able to understand that. And the reasons for that, there are many of them. We won't go into too much, but obviously competition from the government's perspective gets good prices, it gets good products. You know, the government folks are spending, you know, other people's money, tax money, so a lot of this has to do with preventing fraud. You don't want contracting officers, where's Mike? You know, to pick their friends for work. You want it to be fair. And of course, because it's a government program, essentially, you want it to be equal. You know, everybody has an equal opportunity. That's just a principle of how the government should operate. And so that's the reason why we have full and open competition in contracting. I mentioned that that's the rule unless certain exceptions apply. These are some of the exceptions. I know some of you in the room are familiar with these. You know, GSA contracts are a little bit different than full and open competition. The one I want to point out is small business set-aside programs. So that's fundamentally what the VA kind of event is all about. It's doing business with veteran-owned companies. And so as opposed to full and open competition where anybody can bid on a construction contract, the VA, like I mentioned before, has been told you must do competition only with veteran companies, only with service-disabled veteran-owned companies. And that's their mandate. And other agencies have that mandate as well. Not all their money, but a good chunk of DOD's money or DHS money has to go to veteran-owned companies. And they limit, okay, an exception to full and open competition, they limit it to veteran-owned companies. And that's a very powerful program. The next thing I want to talk about real briefly is source selection methods. Okay, so we have this mandate to use full and open competition. There's an awful lot of regulations about how that looks, and there's a lot of statutes about that. We're going to boil it down and be very straightforward and simple today. We're going to talk about two types of procurement methodologies. Okay, and these are the two biggest ones. We're going to focus on what's called FAR Part 14, sealed bidding. Okay, this is a take it or leave it type procurement. The government says, here's the deal. This is what I want to buy. Take it or leave it. You do exactly what I want you to do. FAR Part 15 is called negotiated, contracting by negotiation, and that's more of a let's make a deal. Okay, I know what I want to do, but I want you, the contractor, to come in and help me figure out how to do that, and I'm going to let everybody kind of come up with their own solution within certain parameters. Okay, those are the two main types. Now, sealed bidding is the default rule. If these conditions are met, the agency must use sealed bidding. All right, so if their requirements are known, they know what they want to buy. If you expect to get 2 or more bids, so there's going to be some competition, they have to use this method. And there's no need for discussions. And again, that gets back to, do they really know what they want to buy? And if there's enough time, because there's some timelines built in here. If they don't have enough time, then they can go to some other sole source method or something else. But basically, they have to have time. So think about this. If let's say the government wanted to build a wall between the United States and Canada. Okay, we wanted to keep out Canadians because there are too many Canadian hockey players on American teams, and they're sneaking over the border, taking over all of our hockey teams. So we want to build a wall on the Canadian border. If you know that you want a wall 30 feet high with a certain type of brick with doors every 100 meters and lights and everything, and you know exactly what you want, this is what you would use to do that. Okay? It's really simple. There's a process where the contracting officer issues what's called an invitation for bids, and the rule is the low bid wins, as long as it's a responsible bidder and it's responsive. Again, those two terms being very key. So if you're the low, responsible bidder, you win the work. If you don't satisfy either one of those two requirements, though, you can't win the work. And this results always in a fixed price contract. Government does cost type contracting that's very complicated. Fixed price contract is just what it sounds like. You propose a certain price, the government accepts it, and then that's it. They pay you that, not a dime more. If it costs you more than your bid, you lose money. If it costs you less than your bid, obviously you make money. It's really simple. Now the Part 15 is a negotiated procurement, and I'm going to talk briefly about that. That's if you don't know exactly what you want, and price isn't the only thing that you're going to consider, this is what you go to. Okay, so they buy major weapon systems this way. Let's say you need to build a wall on the Canadian border, but you don't really know how high it should be to keep out the Canadians. You don't know what kind of lights you should have or how many doors you should have. You can describe it, and you can say, it has to be high enough to keep out the average, or the best Canadian hockey players. And it has to have enough doors so that we can, when we catch them, we can kick them out easily in 15 minutes. And so you come and propose to me how to build the wall. And then so they do a technical evaluation. They can compare these different offers, and they consider price, but they consider other factors too. And the contractor comes up with the way to build the wall with some guidance from the government. That's how Part 15 works. And there are, there's opportunities to have discussions with the contractor through this process, and their competitive proposals. So the contracting officer's job or the source selection authority's job is basically to say, this wall is going to be higher, but it's going to cost more money. Do I want to spend more money to get a higher wall with different kinds of lights? They propose, I really like their lights because they're better. But I'm going to spend more money on that, and I'm not going to take the low bid. It's worth it to me to get a higher wall, for example. That's how that works. Okay, any questions about that? That's just a really high-level overview of those two types of procurement. Sir?
Responsible bidders, is that another way of saying that is a qualified bidder?
That's what we're going to talk about after this next piece, okay? So that is actually, in a sense, it's very much that. Okay, so responsiveness. What is that exactly? A FAR Part 14 sealed bid contract is a classic offer and acceptance contract that you learn about in the first year of law school. I make an offer to do something and you accept it. And at common law, there was something called the mirror image rule. And unless you agreed to do exactly what the offer was, there was no contract. So what this is It's an objective determination, and the question here is, has the potential contractor offered to do what the government wants? Okay? Have you met all the material terms of a solicitation without any variation? If you haven't done that, you haven't accepted their offer, okay? Or you haven't made an offer to them that they can accept, better said, and so no contract can be awarded. That's determined at the time the bid is opened, whether or not you've agreed to do what they're asking for. So in the case of the wall, typically the IFB comes out and it describes the wall and everything, and all you do essentially is give a price and you say, I agree to do what you had in the IFB. And what that is technically is a bid or an offer to the government, and then the government accepts it, and the contract is formed when the government accepts your responsive offer. Okay, so the other thing here is if it's not responsive, the contracting officer has to reject it. Okay, they don't have any choice in the matter. Now the key thing here is that if you do a cover letter or provide technical literature with your bid in a circumstance like this, all that is considered and informs part of your bid. All right, and so this is sometimes going to be pretty dangerous because you got to be very careful about what you said. And the bottom line on all this is, have you unconditionally and clearly offered to do what the government wants you to do? Now, by way of example, and these are actual cases, things that either I've dealt with or that have been reported and things like that. I want to point out some of them to you where people get in trouble. And you know, it can be a cover letter that says something. There was a case that involved like asking for certain office space. So a big contractor made a mistake. It was a really big contractor recently. Had an IT consulting contract in DC. They were going to do it. It was a Part 14 IFB. And they said, yeah, we're going to need an office in the government building, in the DHS building, so that we can have somebody on site. And there was nothing about that in the IFB. They didn't say they were going to provide that. And so in the cover letter they did that, and the government said, well, we can't accept that because you're asking for something that's going to save you money. None of the other contractors asked for that, so you're not bidding on the same grounds. You're not responsive. You don't win the contract. Another case where a contractor said, all my information is confidential, don't share it with anybody. Well, there's a Freedom of Information Act, and the government has to be able to share your information. So that's non-responsive. I mean, it's only very limited circumstances where you can keep that information private. Delivery times. Okay, if you say, yeah, you asked for a 120-day delivery, I think we can meet that. We'll be there in about 120 days, we'll meet that delivery schedule. If you qualify it in any way and say, I think I can meet it if I get bank financing, those are all conditions and they destroy the responsiveness of your bid. And therefore you can lose the bid. Now, that concept only strictly applies to FAR Part 14 IFBs. But you should know, in all government contracting, you know, if you do a negotiated procurement, those more complicated procurements, you do have to respond to every material thing that they're asking for. So if they ask you to say, tell us how high your wall is going to be, tell us what kind of lights you're going to have, tell us how many gates you're going to have in the wall, if you don't tell them what kind of lights you're going to have and everything else is great, then again, you're not meeting all the material requirements of the proposal, and you can lose that work for that reason too. You also have to, only in the case of the Part 15, you have to abide by the instructions, and this is a little nitnoity thing that is very important. If they tell you you get 10 pages of Times New Roman 12-point font, double spaced, that's what you get. You don't get 13 pages, and you don't get 11-point type. If you use 11-point type, they'll kick you out. So yeah, and that's because if you use 11-point type, you get more words. You get more words than your competitor. Tain't fair. Goodbye. So pay attention to those instructions. They're extremely important. Any questions on that section so far? All right. Now, responsibility. The concept here is you have offered to the government to do what they've asked. You've given them the low price. Contracting officer looks at it and says, low price, they're responsive, I'm going to give them a contract as long as they're qualified, as long as, in the government's word, they're responsible. All right? And the question here is, this is again responsibility. Purchase shall be made from and contracts awarded to responsible prospective contractors only. That's the general rule again. But the concept here is, does the bidder have the apparent ability and capacity to perform? You've told me you can do it. Do I have confidence? Can I make a determination that you can actually do it? And this can be determined anytime prior to award. And technically, every contract award involves a responsibility determination. Now, does a contracting officer sit down every time and say, does 3M, are they a responsible contractor? Well, no, not really. But if it's any kind of a complicated procurement or you're new to a contracting officer, they're going to go through this process. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that involves. First, though, there are two types of responsibility. There's general responsibility and special responsibility. This is from the Federal Acquisition Regulation, and it's considered in every case. This list of things is what they're told to look at to see, can you build that wall? Do you have the equipment, facilities, and capacity to do it? Can you manage a project of that complexity? Do you have the technical capability? Can you meet our delivery schedule? I want that wall built before the next season. Before we start playing hockey in 2017, I want a wall to keep those Canadians out. What's your performance record? Did you ever build a wall before? Maybe there's a wall on the Mexican border and you built part of that. That's what they're going to look for there. Do you have the financial resources, the bonding or the line of credit, to finance this project and actually pull it off? And finally, and very importantly, do you have the business ethics to do a government contract? Are you going to be straight with me and do accurate reporting and be a fair business partner with me? Special standards are different. And the deal here is many contracts require additional kind of qualifications, if you will. And so instead of building a wall, let's say that you're a company that's going to build either a nuclear power facility of some kind. Okay, you need a special license from the Nuclear Regulatory Commission to get involved in that work. And they don't want to award a contract to somebody just on the, without knowing that. So they'll write into sometimes solicitations that says, with your bid or with your proposal, provide evidence that you have a license from the NRC. Provide evidence that you have whatever specific qualifications that they're interested in for that procurement. And you have to then provide it with your bid. Okay? Other responsibility determinations can be made after the fact. In a general, construction contract circumstance, you have to get a permit from the city to put a porta potty on site, to stack your materials over here in this area, or block the street with a crane or something. That you can get all that after you awarded the contract. Those are general responsibility requirements, but sometimes there are these special ones, and you have to be very careful when those are there to make sure that you answer them. Okay. This is the general rule. And the general rule, again, is that in the absence of actual information that a company or a contractor is responsible, the contracting officer has to find you non-responsible. All right? So there's a burden of proof here, and it's on the contractor to show the government that you can do the work. There are lots of ways the government gets information. It's a busy slide. I'm going to tell you it's got two different clauses, and they appear in many solicitations. The first one, 52, tells you that it's a clause. 212 means that it has to do with Part 12 of the Federal Acquisition Regulation dealing with commercial item contracting, and it's certifications and representations on a commercial item contract. All right? And part of it is it's representations about your responsibility. I file all my labor law reports, I'm not suspended or debarred, I've got all this stuff in there, and there's a long detailed list of representations. You're essentially telling the contracting officer, I meet all these, I'm qualified to do this contract. So read that very carefully. There's a lot of things in there, and you need to understand what you're signing up for. The other clause is 209. That has to do with the responsibility part, Part 9 of the FAR, and that's a certification for larger contracts. Contracts have $150,000 or more. Again, about not being suspended or debarred, you don't have any tax liabilities. Again, getting to the ethics piece, the business ethics piece of the responsibility determination. So that's an important source. This is, again, I think this is on your materials too, so there are other sources of responsibility information, and the government maintains databases about PEPRS, the Past Performance System. SAM, which you've all signed up for, includes representations and certifications about your company, what you can do, and what your status is. That's important. And then there are other records and what they call experience data. And it'd be interesting to know that contracting officers can rely on things they hear in the office. Okay, so what does the other contracting officer say about a company? And as long as that's verifiable, they can consider that in a responsibility determination. So If a contracting officer says, they're a terrible contractor, they deliver late all the time, they always have excuses, they do bad work, bad product, and they have bad people on the site or whatever, all that's relevant, and they can consider that. Now, on the other hand, if you have a glowing recommendation and a glowing reputation, they can consider that as well. But that's a valid source of information, so that's important. And then finally, prospective contractors, including bid and proposal information. So you can give information to contracting folks about your company to show them what your capabilities are, capability statements and product literature, company literature and things. And that other list, and this is the kind of stuff that should go into that information. You should think about looking at for those kinds of purposes. Okay. One final thing on the whole responsibility piece, and that is, I've talked about how the contracting officer makes these responsibility determinations, okay? Not only have you offered to do what they want, but are you capable of doing it? The good thing for small businesses, the contracting officer cannot make a negative determination about a small business on their own. They have to go to the Small Business Administration and ask them to make that determination. And under the FAR, there's a thing called the Certificate of Competency Program, and the Small Business Administration is there because they have expertise in dealing with small businesses and their particular capabilities and what they are. So if a contracting officer ever tells you, I didn't award you this contract because I found you to be not responsible, there should be a bell that goes off in your head and say, wait a minute. He has to go to the SBA. She has to ask the SBA that question, and if she hasn't done it, you need to consider that and see, well, maybe you want to protest it or get the SBA involved, because oftentimes they'll come in and they'll say, no, this letter of credit is what small businesses typically operate on, or it's not unusual for them to work this way, and they can perform this contract. We have confidence that they can, and the SBA will come in and potentially be your ally in that circumstance and get you a positive responsibility determination. That's very important. Okay, so any questions so far? All right, we're pretty much on schedule here. All right, so best practices. In terms of responsiveness, remember, and the first thing is, and it sounds kind of silly, but know what you're dealing with a particular solicitation. Is it a Part 14 invitation for bid, or is it a Part 15 negotiated procurement? It's surprising how often the government doesn't get their solicitations exactly right. And in certain parts of the solicitation, they might say, your bid is due by a certain time, but they'll also have complicated evaluation factors. So they'll call it a bid, but in reality, they're looking at things other than price, and so it's really a negotiated procurement, and it's hard to tell what they're after. And there should be a time to ask questions and clarify that, because that's a very important point, whether it's a bid or a request for proposals. That's very important. If it's a bid, carefully review all your cover letters and your collateral material, your literature, okay? Because if your product only has a USB interface and they're asking for a serial, I don't know, what's, a different interface for your equipment, okay? If your literature doesn't match to what the IFB says, you can get kicked out for that reason very easily, and you should be, because you got to offer the government exactly what they're after. And finally, in this area, do not condition your bid on getting financing or getting space in the building or asking for anything that's not specifically laid out there. They're paying you for that. Include it in your price and bid accordingly. In terms of responsibility, best practices, do an audit. Take that list that I had up there before and just walk through mentally or physically through your company and say, look, when I go talk to these folks in November, how am I going to explain that? How am I going to convey to them that I'm responsible and I have all these capabilities for what I do? So construction contractors, obviously easy. You need to know your bonding capacity, all right? And you need to have evidence of that at all times. I mean, that's fundamental to what they do. And so what story would you tell? Make sure that SAM information is all up to date and complete, because SAM trumps whatever you tell them when you submit a bid. They're going to go online, they're required to go online, look at SAM, look at FAPIS, look at all these databases, and if they don't match what you've told them, they're going to go with the written, or at least because it's ambiguous, all right? If you tell them, in your bid, hey, I'm a small business, but if SAM doesn't say you're a small business, they don't know. There's a question there, and they're going to say, I'm not going to award to this company. So make sure that's up to date and matches what you're telling them. Okay. carefully and thoughtfully prepare capability statements and other company literature with that list in mind. And again, to convey that, when you decide that I'm the low bid or I'm the best proposal or what have you, I can do the work, and here's evidence of that, because they need evidence of it. You can tell them to make that determination. Otherwise, they have to find you not responsible. Remember that there is something called special standards of responsibility. Always look at your paperwork, especially if it's an unusual contract engagement of some kind, to see if there are any special standards in there. And remember that the contracting officer cannot make a non-responsibility determination about a small business without going to the SBA first. That's very important. Okay, so that's kind of a whirlwind trip through some basic concepts to get you thinking about how it's different to go in and do business with the government, and a little bit at a high level about what contracting officers must look for and must find in order to award you a contract. Are there any questions? Yes, Rodney.
Suppose you have a new product or service that the government hasn't considered before, and you want to submit, let's say, an unsolicited type bid. How is that handled?
If they don't have a pre-identified requirement that they're going to compete, there's a part of the FAR that does that. And then if they find that it's meritorious and everything, they'll want proof, obviously, that it works, and then they can award a sole source contract in an appropriate case if it's something that they really need.
Where does that process start? With the contracting officer, with someone in the...
Every agent's a lot of agencies have a place where you can send unsolicited proposals for a new idea, new concept. I mean, it doesn't make any sense to go in and submit an unsolicited proposal for, I've got a great desktop computer, with a 27-inch screen. That's not what they're talking about. But if you have new technology that is, you either have a patent on it or a trade secret or something, and you can say, hey, look, I can catch cyber hackers a special way. And the government's never seen this before. I want to come in and talk to you about it, and you can get non-disclosure agreements in place and things like that. But most agencies will have a point of contact to take those in. And you got to be very careful, because obviously you're showing your cards, and you got to make sure you follow the process that's in the FAR. Edna. Sort of. A request for quote is under FAR Part 13, and that's a little bit of a different duck, because what you're doing there is the government says, okay, tell me how much you would charge me to build a wall, and it can be either a full requirements laid out specifications, or they can ask you for a proposal-ish. And what they're asking you to do, though, is to give them information. Then they make an offer back to you. Okay, and with a quote, the contractor actually accepts the government's offer to do something. So there's no contract until you've accepted it. So if you do an RFQ and the government says, okay, now I want to buy your widgets, or I want you to build this wall, there's no contract until you either start performing or you say yes. So it's a different circumstance, but they have to make a responsibility determination, and you have to actually promise to do what they want, depending on how it's written. Mike.
Is the content of my bid ever available to anybody else?
Under the Freedom of Information Act, the government must give any of their records to anybody who asks for it. Okay, and a bid is a record, unless an exception applies. All right, and the biggest exception that's applicable is for confidential business and financial information. So different class, but you should, if you have prices or something that's proprietary, or you have technology that's proprietary, you can mark those pages with a legend that says, this, please give it FOIA treatment, exception 4, or words to that effect. And there are actually words in the FAR to do that, that you can mark it, and that'll keep it presumably out of their hand. Not fail-safe, because I've done these searches before, or had people do them for me in the government, but that's your best. Yeah, so the answer is there's an exception you can take advantage of, and most often it'll be successful. Ma'am?
And so many rules to follow can certainly discourage someone from not pursuing. Why will someone want to go through this?
Well, a couple things. I've always told people that I don't think the rules are difficult. They're just sort of complicated in certain circumstances, but once you got them, they're fairly easy to follow. And if you're successful in laying the right foundation, you basically have a customer that will always pay. They'll never go bankrupt. They'll always pay. and they're always buying stuff. The government buys everything. But you do have to get into it, cautiously, I guess, and with some preparation. That's, again, why you're here.
It gives you also the advantage that you can have indefinite term contracts for 4 years or something.
Mm-hmm.
So you don't have to keep doing it over and over. You just do it once.
Right.
And then it lasts a long time. And you can.
Yep. So either of these types of contract I've talked about can be indefinite quantity, indefinite delivery. And so you get a base year, and the government can then, once they give you the contract, they can just send orders on that contract over and over again. And then they can renew the contract, up to 5 years. GSA contracts can be 20-year contracts. So once you get it, you've got 20 years worth of great customer, and you can sell things very easily to the federal government. Okay, so Pat Dotter is going to follow me, talk about preparing some collateral material.